It is difficult to believe that there was something worse than the Nazi extermination camps, but if there was, we would likely be talking about the massacres committed by the Einsatzgruppen. This was a task force organized by the Nazi security forces, mainly composed of the most sadistic members of the SS, Waffen-SS, and the German police. The Einsatzgruppen etched their name in the darkest pages of history by cold-bloodedly murdering over 1 million people for no reason other than believing themselves superior. In today's video, we will share with you the horrific annihilations committed by this group of Nazis, where and how they occurred, and also explore the repercussions they had at the Nuremberg trials. We warn you that the accounts in this presentation are truly shocking. Welcome once again to Military History. Einsatzgruppen, which in German means operational groups or task forces, was one of the most feared terms for the Jewish community during the height of the Third Reich. These death units were a detachment of the SS and initially operated superficially until they were given clearer directives. They first participated in the annexation of Austria in 1938 and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Later, in a more active and bloodthirsty manner, they operated in Poland in 1939. In all these cases, their function was to carry out tasks indicated by the SS. However, it was not until 1941, during the invasion of the Soviet Union, that they began to operate as true autonomous special units. Let's trace where these deadly squads originated. The Einsatzgruppen were formed under the direction of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich and operated by the Schutzstaffel before and during World War II. Initially, their role was to secure government buildings and documents after the Anschluss in Austria in March 1938, which could be understood as an intelligence service task, initially non-violent. Originally part of the Sicherheitspolizei, or German security police, 2 Einsatzgruppe units were stationed performing tasks in the Sudetenland in October 1938. When military action proved unnecessary due to the Munich agreements, the Einsatzgruppen were assigned to seize government and police documents, secure government buildings, interrogate high-ranking officials, and arrest up to 10,000 Czech communists and German citizens suspected of treason. From September 1939, the general command of the Einsatzgruppen fell under the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, which began assigning them more inhumane and bloodthirsty tasks. In their violent second stage, the Einsatzgruppen began extermination missions, suppressing everything considered undesirable and inferior to Nazism. As part of the campaign to eliminate the so-called undesirable elements of the German population in 1939, these operational groups participated in the sinister Action T4 program. This project involved the coordination of systematic killings carried out by the Nazi regime of individuals with physical and mental disabilities, as well as patients in psychiatric hospitals. Action T4 took place mainly between 1939 and 1941, but it is known that the killings continued until the end of the war. Initially, victims were shot by the Einsatzgruppe, but from the spring of 1940, they implemented other methodologies, such as gas trucks. Next, we will see an explanation of their methods in the Nuremberg trials.
Another form of extermination employed was asphyxiation by lethal gases in enclosed trucks or vans. Here again, the victims were induced to enter these death machines by the promise that they would be transported to other areas for resettlement. As the van left the loading area, it was filled with deadly fumes. A few minutes later, when the van reached the disposal point, the corpses were unloaded into prepared excavations, which became unmarked mass graves. These, then, were the usual methods used by the Einsatzgruppen.
The involvement of the Einsatzgruppen in the inhumane action T4 was just the beginning of a path of death and cruelty rarely seen in human history. Their main task, in the words of SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski at the Nuremberg trials, was the priority killing of Jews, gypsies, and political opponents. According to the records and reports kept by these individuals, they took the lives of 1.5 million people, almost exclusively civilians, without judicial supervision or any legal backing. In clearer terms, it was a cruel and bloodthirsty regiment tasked with murdering those indicated by the high Nazi command, strictly based on racial issues. The Nazis considered Soviet citizens and Jews racially and ideologically inferior, believing them indistinguishable from each other. This was partly due to the prejudice and disdain with which the Nazi regime viewed the communist government system in the Soviet Union, which Hitler and his allies considered dangerous and saw as the main ideological enemy of the fascism they were advancing. That is why the Nazi regime considered communists and Jews as the primary enemies to be stopped and exterminated. In their view, this would allow Germany to win the war and ensure the supremacy of the Aryan race throughout Europe, without the genes and offspring of inferior races interfering in the development of the Nazi racial dream. In response to Adolf Hitler's plan to invade Poland on September 3, 1939, Heydrich reorganized the Einsatzgruppen to travel alongside the German armies during the attack and placed SS Obergruppenführer Werner Best in command. This man appointed Hans-Joachim Tesmer to select personnel for the task forces and their subgroups, called Einsatzkommandos, choosing individuals educated with military experience, but above all with a strong ideological commitment to Nazism. Many members of these forces already had paramilitary experience. Initially, these squads had 2,700 men, but they would soon rise to 4,150 in Poland. Heydrich instructed Wagner to have the Einsatzgruppen carry out their operations in cooperation with the Ordnungspolizei, the public order police, and local military commanders who agreed to collaborate with the Nazis. Despite being a small number, these operational groups were tasked with annihilating all members of the Polish leadership clearly identified with Polish national identity. The Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, which were lists of people to be exterminated, had been prepared by the SS as early as May 1939, using files compiled by the SD from 1936 onwards. These lists included intellectuals, members of the clergy, teachers, and people belonging to the nobility. In Hitler's own words, not a single Polish leader should remain. Where Polish leaders exist, they must be killed. The Einsatzgruppen carried out the murders of the Polish leadership with the support of the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz, a paramilitary group formed by ethnic Germans living in Poland who supported Hitler's cause from there. Other collaborators were some members of the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the Ordnungspolizei, who also shot civilians during the Polish campaign. The exact number of the tragedy is unknown, but approximately 65,000 civilians were killed by the end of 1939 in the invasion of Poland. In addition to the leaders of Polish society, they killed Jews, prostitutes, Roma, and mentally ill individuals, ruthlessly pursuing the idea of racial cleansing.
Heinrich Himmler was horrified. He had found it easy to order other people to kill, but to be in the presence of people being shot in large numbers into a pit and to hear their screaming and moaning and see their writhing was more than he could stomach. And he started running around hysterically, screaming, "Kill them quickly, kill them quickly." And this was just about the time when the decision came to move the Jews of Western Europe, which followed directly from the United States joining the war as the result of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. That's when Himmler said, okay, the gloves are off, basically. And they began to think about moving all the Jews of Western Europe.
Before the deadly systematic camps were established, there was much more horror. Although formally under the command of the army, the Einsatzgruppen received their orders from Heydrich and, for the most part, acted independently of the army. Many senior officers of the German armed forces were relieved that these forces took care of genocidal actions, as these murders violated the rules of war established in the Geneva Conventions. However, Hitler had decreed that the army would have to tolerate and even provide logistical support to the Einsatzgruppen when tactically possible. This meant not only that the Führer was aware of the sadistic tasks of these squads, but also encouraged them. Some army commanders complained about unauthorized shootings, looting, and rapes committed by members of the Einsatzgruppen and the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz, but no high-ranking Nazi official seemed to respond to the complaints. For example, when Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz sent a memorandum complaining to Hitler about the atrocities, the Chancellor dismissed his concerns as childish and cowardly. Not content with humiliating him, the Führer relieved Blaskowitz of his position and put an end to his military career growth. Once the complete invasion of the territory was achieved, the final task of the Einsatzgruppen in Poland was to gather the remaining Jews, those whom they had not killed in a massacre, and concentrate them in ghettos within major cities with railway connections. The ultimate intention was clear: to eliminate all Jews from Poland, but their final fate had not yet been determined or systematized. That would happen later, as described by a specialized historian.
Tenían las manos ocupadas. Estaban tratando a cientos de miles de personas, una bala para cada uno. Había que cavar una fosa común, había que reunir a la gente. Eso costaba tiempo, era un problema. Tenían un grave problema de logística. Así que la Einsatzgruppen terminó precediendo a los campos de concentración. Y en mi opinión, como historiador, que he investigado muy detalladamente los documentos, fueron la razón por la que se inventaron estos campos.
The annihilation of Polish intelligence after the invasion of the country became the first act of the implementation of what would be called Die Endlösung der Judenfrage, in English, the final solution to the Jewish question, in the territories conquered by Nazi Germany. Although it may seem incredible until this moment, the Einsatzgruppen believed they were doing good to humanity because they were dealing with ethnicities they considered subhuman. Moreover, they believed they were morally superior since they showed mercy and only executed the civilian male population with these characteristics. But soon, that dubious humanity would be abandoned altogether in the conquest of Soviet territory. It was already established that the Nazi regime would equate Jews with communists, so the invasion of the Soviet Union was directly an offensive to completely annihilate the enemy. On March 13, 1941, in the period leading up to Operation Barbarossa, Hitler decreed that Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler would receive special tasks by direct orders of the Führer, which he would carry out independently. This directive meant that the Einsatzgruppen were under the control of the sinister Himmler, with an atrocious aggravation. Hitler specified that criminal acts against civilians committed by his troops during the campaign would not be prosecuted in military courts and would, therefore, go unpunished. In other words, there was a green light to kill. All elements were aligned for genocide to be committed, and that was exactly what happened. Most horribly of all, it was carefully prepared. In organizational meetings in June 1941, Himmler described to the top SS leaders the regime's intention to reduce the population of the Soviet Union by 30 million people, not only through the direct murder of those considered racially inferior, but also by depriving the rest of food and other basic needs so that they would perish like animals. The Einsatzgruppen, following the German army into the Soviet Union, were composed of 4 battalion-sized groups of 500 to 900 men each, all ready to exterminate Jews and communists. The 4 main Einsatzgruppen participated in mass shootings from the early days of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Initially, the targets were adult Jewish men, but soon women, children, and the elderly were also included. Initially, attempts were made to justify the killings by alleging false charges against the victims, who were then executed by a firing squad. As this method proved too slow, the Einsatzkommandos began gathering Jews in large groups and shooting them directly into mass graves dug by the victims themselves. Later, a squad officer would machine gun the pile of corpses in case anyone was still alive. Despite this method of mass murder, there were some survivors, and this is one of their testimonies.
Mi padre me abrazó y me puso las manos en la nuca. Las ametralladoras empezaron a... y yo caí. Recuerdo lo que sentí entonces. Mi madre me empujó. Yo caí y él me cayó encima. Creo que me cayó encima. No le vi cayendo, pero estaba encima de mí. Estaba encima, abrazándome y escupiendo sangre. Tras unos segundos, dejó de moverse.
As if ruthlessly executing the entire Jewish community without any compassion were not enough, the Einsatzgruppen used terror as a sadistic tool. In villages, they promoted the idea that the neighbors themselves should collectively murder the Jewish families residing there in organized lynchings, creating a general psychosis against those persecuted by the Nazis. After a while, Himmler realized that the murder methods used by the Einsatzgruppen were inefficient because they were costly and did not kill the victims quickly enough. It was then that one of the most commonly used tools in Action T4 was once again employed, the deadly gas vans. These sinister vehicles began to be used by the main Einsatzgruppen from 1942. However, they were not popular among the Einsatzkommandos because removing the bodies from the van and burying them was a horrifying experience. Prisoners or auxiliaries were often assigned to perform this task to avoid traumatizing the SS men, but the true trauma fell upon the involuntary witnesses of these atrocious massacres.
Lo vi. Vi cómo mataban a niños pequeños. Los mataban sin piedad. Vi con mis propios ojos cómo mataban a un niño. Fue la policía. Le dispararon sin piedad.
Los llevaban a algún sitio y les disparaban hasta la noche.
Luego los tiraban a la fosa, estuvieran vivos o muertos.
Yo volví a casa y vi cómo disparaban a 2 niños cerca de la escuela. Eran niños pequeños. Los pusieron en fila y les dispararon. Uno de ellos tenía incluso un trozo de pan en la mano.
After the end of World War II, 24 high-ranking leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were prosecuted in the Einsatzgruppen trial, part of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. The message from the lead prosecutor, Benjamin Ferencz, was clear and precise.
Reports will show that the slaughter committed by these defendants was dictated not by military necessity, but by that supreme perversion of thought, the Nazi theory of the master race. We shall show that these deeds of men in uniform were the methodical execution of long-range plans to destroy ethnic, national, political, and religious groups which stood condemned in the Nazi mind.
The men of this group were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in the SS. However, 14 death sentences, of which only 4 were carried out, and 2 life sentences were the only verdicts for these hellish squads. Most of the rank-and-file members of the Einsatzgruppen were never formally charged and returned to civilian life as if nothing had happened. In total, the Einsatzgruppen cold-bloodedly murdered over 1.5 million Jews, communists, prisoners of war, and Roma with the greatest imaginable cruelty, all to establish the dominance of a supposed superior race. We are now reaching the end of this terrible story, and we wanted to ask you, do you think all members of the Einsatzgruppen should have been sentenced to death or life imprisonment? Share your opinions in the comments below. That concludes today's video. We appreciate you staying until the end and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.